And we're recording. So. All right. So we should all be back. If possible, if you guys could please do me a favor and open up your cameras. It does help for me to see somebody, man. I don't feel like I'm talking to myself. You'll be surprised how your facial expressions lets me know that you have a question or I said some shit that y'all don't understand. So that's why I asked for that. Okay. So what we've read for this week was the autobiographical text by Malidoma Patrice Somé of Water in the Spirit, Ritual, Magic, and the Life and the Initiation of an African Shaman, right? So these are his firsthand accounts of his life. We just read the introduction to the text, right? So if you guys have time, I would definitely recommend this text. If we have time today, I'll show you how I was introduced to this. I'll explain how I was introduced to this text through being an undergrad student like yourselves. So for me, one of the things that leapt off the page or jumped off the page initially was his name, right? And how he articulates the significance of his name and how his name details or delineates his purpose for life, right? He says his name is Malidoma, which means to be friends with, strangers, or the enemy, right? And he goes into explaining how him being kidnapped from his home in the Dagara region of Burkina Faso and taken to the French missionary school began him on his journey to fulfilling his destiny or fulfilling his purpose, right? He says that, you know, the name for some people, especially within the Dagara culture, the names describes the task of their bearers, right? So I thought that was of great importance. Another thing that stood out to me was the obstacles that he encountered in trying to produce this text, right? He said the obstacle of language was kind of stifling for him in his production of the text because there was things that happened in the Dagara culture that there is not words for in the English language, right? And, you know, if you are to read further into the text, he articulates and he describes happenings that are beyond even our reason as individuals. Like he describes things that don't make sense. He describes things that defy the laws of gravity, right? He mentions briefly his his grandfather's funeral. He mentions this very briefly, but as he gets into the text and he articulates his grandfather's funeral, right? It's some shit that you'd be like, there's no way that happened. There's no way. He describes his grandfather making his transition in their home, right? But then a few miles out is where they have the ceremonies for burials. And the town's elders came through, they did a ritual, they sprayed some of their herbs and spices around the grandfather, right? Burnt their sage, dipped into their magic bags, gave his grandfather the talisman that he describes later in the introduction, and the grandfather arises up and a funeral procession starts and he dances. The grandfather who's transitioned, right? He rises up from his bed and dances to the ceremony where they're having the burial, right? So in our understanding, there's no way that could happen. That's a Walking Dead shit, right? Like that just does not happen. But these are the normal occurrences for the Dagara tribe, right? So he's saying that the English language doesn't provide words for that type of activity. So it created a difficulty, a struggle for him in his ability and his desire to produce this text, right? So that's one of his obstacles that he faced. Then another thing that stuck out to me was he mentions that his culture has a deep respect for the elders and a deep respect for babies, right? Another thing that statement becomes important, that society, the Dagara society, is built around the reverence for your ancestors, okay? For those who made their transition. When I say transition, what you would call being dead, right? I just don't really use that term because in the African spiritual concept, there is no dead, right? You just transition to the next stage of life. But when you become an ancestor, right, that's what they honor and that's what they reverence. So the elders and the youth, the babies, are the closest, are highest reverenced in that society because they're closest to the ancestors, right? Why would I say that the elders and babies are closest to the ancestors?
Because that as a baby, you're newly informed, and then when you're old, you're kind of like forgetting things already, and you're like a baby when you're old, and vice versa. Yeah.
Right. So when you're a baby, you're fresh out the womb, right? You're fresh out of that portal that brings you into this realm, right? As you're an elder, you're getting closer and closer to transitioning to going back to that other realm, right? Another thing that becomes important, especially as it pertains to babies, right? The Dagara believe that everyone, and really all African spiritual traditions believe that everyone is placed on this earth with a purpose, right? They also believe that you choose your parents because your parents, whether it be it subconscious or conscious, will push you along closer to fulfilling your purpose, right? And as a parent, it's your job to help your children understand their purpose. Another concept that becomes important as it pertains to this passage, right? They believe that the grandparents would manifest in the children, right? So in that society, they believe that Maladoma's grandfather would reproduce himself or remanifest himself or reincarnate himself some way, somehow into Maladoma's children, right? So my grandmother, what, 11 years? So about 11 years, she made her transition. My daughter is 6. My grandmother's name is Ramona. My daughter's middle name is Ramona, right? My daughter is like super feminine, like super feminine. So mind you, she's 6 and she literally sits with her legs crossed like she's a grown ass woman, right? Now, not to take anything away from my wife as not being feminine, but like my daughter is like uber feminine, right? When she plays, she has like this big ass dollhouse, like takes up half the room. When she plays, she likes to decorate her dolls in fashion and things of this nature, right? My wife, again, is not really into things like that a lot, right? She's fashionable, she knows how to decorate, but that's not her thing. Now, my grandmother, right, that was her thing. She did fashion shows. Anytime we had a party, she decorated for the parties, right? She decorated for weddings, right? So this is an example of the grandparents returning and manifesting themselves in the grandchildren, right? So that's why I bring this up, okay? So this reverence that they have for the babies and for the elders, right? Because it ties them to the ancestors, okay? Then he has this notion, I'm gonna read it, it's on page 4, and he talks about the preservation of culture, okay? I'll read the whole passage. So it starts on the bottom of page 3, bottom line of page 3, and it'll go into the first paragraph of page 4. But while the West is engaged in a great debate about what it means to preserve culture, the indigenous world is aware that it has already lost the battle. It seems obvious to me that as soon as one culture begins to talk about preservation, it means that it has already turned the other culture into an endangered species, right? So let's talk about how that plays out in real time. So I don't know how many of you guys are like into art, right? Or into museums and things, artifacts and things of that nature. I like to fuck with museums, right? But there's a very large conversation going on, especially in these European museums, Britain and France in particular, that we need to get those African artifacts back to the communities that they belong to, right? Has anybody seen the movie Black Panther?
Yes.
So when he says, yeah, how did you get that? That's from my ancestors. How did you get that? You stole it, right? So that exchange is what's taking place on a larger scale now, right? We need to get those artifacts back to the people who you stole and pillaged them from. This is what Malidoma is talking about, right? So if I'm in a dialogue or if I'm in a debate about having my culture preserved and someone outside of my culture is dictating how my culture will be preserved, that culture no longer belongs to me. Does that make sense? Do you get what he's trying to say there, right? So another thing that is at play, think about what Malidoma's purpose is, right? He is to exist between two worlds, so to speak. The world of the Dagara, where he comes from, his indigenous world, and then the world of the other, the white man's world, where he was kidnapped too, right? And he's supposed to befriend those enemies, okay? So there's two separate components, two separate cultures at play here. So what he's saying is, once one culture, the European culture, is deciding how to preserve the African culture has already lost itself. It belongs now. No, I'm not gonna say it belongs. It has been overpowered by the European culture. Okay, so that's another point that was prevalent to me. Also, the idea. So I don't know if you guys picked up when he talks about his talisman, right? Do you guys know? So when I say the talisman, you guys know what I'm saying? You know what I'm talking about? Okay, so again, going back to Maldoma's purpose, he's supposed to bring the knowledge of his world to the other world and siphon the knowledge of the other world and bring it back to his world, right? He's going to serve as a mediary between the two worlds, right? So in order for him to do that, he was tasked to go to college, to go to the university. And he says, you know, typically it's highly competitive. The only people that have access to these universities are either sons of politicians, daughters of politicians, or their parents are wealthy enough to be able to bribe their way into college, right? USC scandal. But what Malidoma says, you know, I didn't have parents who were wealthy. I didn't have parents who could kind of get me into college. But what I had was my ritual, my elders, and my community magic, right? And he says somehow, some way, he was able to be accepted into the university. And then he says when he gets to the university, I didn't go to school much. I didn't study much. I would just show up to my exam and I would read the answers to my exam on my professors' faces with the help of my talisman, right? So he's able to use the knowledge of his community to allow him to successfully navigate his time at the university, right? To help him fulfill his purpose of learning the other culture's way, right? So what that speaks to is this notion of funds of knowledge. You should write this down. Funds of knowledge, F-U-N-D of knowledge, right? And this is from a scholar by the name of Tara, T-A-R-A, Yosso, Y-O-S-S-O, funds of knowledge. And what this is her critique or her counter to a theory set in place by a French philosopher named Pierre Bourdieu. And Pierre Bourdieu produces this notion of community capital. I'm sorry, that's not what it's called. Social capital, okay? Social capital. And what Bourdieu was trying to understand is why are certain communities successful in school and certain communities not, right? And what Bourdieu asserts is cultural capital is the reason why. I'm able to take my kids to the museum, cultural capital, right? I'm able to take my kids to the opera, cultural capital, right? When my kids play soccer, they're on the same team as their teachers, right? So the teachers' kids are on the same team as my kids. So when I go to the soccer games, I'm able to mingle with my kid's teacher. We build a rapport and there's an understanding there. Cultural capital, right? So this is what Bourdieu is articulating. So in response, Yosso says, well, cultural capital only manifests in a particular community in a particular way, right? i.e. it's a European thing, right? Funds of knowledge is for communities that don't get recognized widely, right? Funds of knowledge would be considered your mom teaching you how to make tamales, right? Passing that down as a family tradition. That's a funds of knowledge, right? The adage in the Black community that you have to be twice as good as everyone else to be recognized, right? That's a funds of knowledge. That's something that your generation passes down from generation to generation to help you navigate this world, right? So funds of knowledge, Yosso argues, is just as or more important than cultural capital, right? Because it sustains a community that is marginalized. Ultimately, these funds of knowledge are not recognized by dominant society, but Yosso is pushing us and provoking us to look at these at more closely, right? And what Malidoma gives us is a perfect example of funds of knowledge. His talisman allowed him to graduate the university, right? Without having to do a lot of study, without having to show up to class a lot, right? he makes a claim on page 7, and I'll read the claim, and then I'll discuss to you why this is important, for me at least. Here in the West, I have a great deal of time for spiritual contemplation and study, and much more time to share things of the spirit with others. If I were still living in my village in Africa, nearly every spare moment would be taken up with scratching a living from the exhausted soil that is all colonialism has left us with, right? So it's this claim that him being in the West, him being in America, allows for more time for spiritual contemplation and study, right? I disagree with that claim. So think about your fourth component of your journal, the question, right? I want you guys to think about these questions. So what I'm going to demonstrate is how to formulate a question that's situated in a critique, okay? So we know what the claim is. Malidoma is claiming that him being in America allows him to study more and to contemplate aspects of the spirit, right? That's the claim. So my question is Malidoma's ability to study and contemplate spirit due to the fact that he is a professor? And because of him being a professor, he has the financial ability, right, not to be tied down, right? You guys understand my question, okay? So this is a question. Sorry, go ahead. Somebody has something to say?
So are you making the question so it could be because of the that he can't afford it, kind of? Like there's people that can't afford it? Are you opening to that?
Yes, right. So to Trisha's point, okay? How many hours is considered full-time?
Full-time, wouldn't it be like in total?
Yeah, for 1 week of work, how many hours is considered?
8 times 7, like 48?
40 hours. Yeah, around 40 hours is the minimum of full-time work, okay?
Yeah.
So if you're working a full-time job, which is 40 hours a week, right? You don't have time to study and to spiritually contemplate, right? I know quite a few of y'all are working full-time or doing quite a bit of work, and it's hard for you to even study with being in school, right? So let alone be an outside of school, not being a student and picking up time to study. Our society is not built for that. The Western world is not built for spiritual contemplation and study, right? The only reason why Malidoma has that time is because he's a professor. So a lot of my time, also because I'm in a Ph.D. program, right, is spent studying. Before class starts, I'm reading, right? Before I go to bed, I'm reading, right? My free time, I'm reading, right? That's due to my profession. When I was working at Apple, my life was not situated like that. My time was spent doing the shit that Apple wanted me to do, right? So also being a professor allows you a certain amount of financial freedom, right? You get paid well. Not in my case, I'm an adjunct professor. Cal State LA is one of the poorest paying Cal States out of all the Cal State system, right? So I can't speak to that, not yet, but just due to his positionality, right? Him being a professor, him being well off, he has the ability to study and contemplate, right? So this is an example of me phrasing a question that's situated in critique. I disagree with what he's claiming, and my question is articulating my disagreement, right? So this is what I mean when I say you're forming questions or posing questions that are critiques, right? And then, okay, so on page 8 and 9, we have a really interesting exchange. He talks about how the Dagara Society does not have a word for the supernatural, right? And this is on the first full paragraph on page 8. It says there's no word for supernatural, right? And then he goes on to page 9 and he talks about the experiment that he does with his elders, where he brought a VCR and he brought a small TV and he showed them Star Trek, right? And he wanted to see how they would interpret or analyze or make sense of Star Trek. And he said for them, it didn't seem unnatural. It didn't seem beyond reason, right? They said that the character Spock remind them of an individual that they have within their community, right? So these things that the West views as supernatural or these things that the West views as their future, the Dagara understood that as their now, right? And then he has a very, really beautiful quote at the end of this paragraph here on page 9. He says, the irony is that the West sees the indigenous world as primitive or archaic. Wouldn't it be wonderful if the West could learn to be as archaic as my elders? What do you think that means? What do you think that means for the West? So do you guys understand the distinction between the West and his hometown, right? We're talking about Dagara and Africa and Burkina Faso. So the West would be considered the Americas, Europe, right? That's pretty much it for the most part. So he's saying the irony is the West sees the Dagara people and their world as primitive, as archaic, right? Counter argument, wouldn't it be wonderful if the West could learn to be as archaic as my elders? And again, what he's talking about is how we have this fabulated TV show, this made up TV show called Star Trek, right? That's how the West views their future. That's how the West views their progress, right? And for the Dagara, that's not their future, that's their now, right? That's their past and their present. So who's really primitive? What the West is hoping to happen, the Dagara are already experiencing and are living in this moment, right? So what is he trying to say with, wouldn't it be wonderful if the West could learn to be as archaic, air quotes, as my elders are? What do you think is the claim there?
I feel the claim is like they should try to have like connection with one another.
Absolutely, right? So instead of looking down on these separate cultures, because they're not like you, they don't interpret technology the way that you do, learn from them, right? There could be some things that they're more advanced in than what you are, right? So who's the real archaic one, right? Who's really primitive here, okay? Further down on page 9, he talks about like the restlessness in the people within the Western world, right? And he says this restlessness is due to the lack of connection with their ancestors, right? I don't know, for me, it makes me think of the movie Coco, right? Like the whole premise of that movie was to honor your ancestors, right? To get grandma up on the altar, right? Like that's what the essence of that movie was, right? He's saying the West is out of pocket because they don't know how to honor their ancestors, right? Think about how we treat elders in this society. What do you do with old folks when they get old?
They just put them in either retirement homes or they treat them bad, honestly. Like you could tell. It's kind of sad. Like even sometimes even the kids like leave them like nothing, you know? It's
Yep.
sad. It's sad.
So think about how we treat our elders in this society, and think about how the Dagara reverences their elders in their society, right? Think about that juxtaposition. I don't know if you guys still have your grandmothers around or your grandfathers around. One, I would advocate to spend some time just listening to them, right? Just listen and peep how much information that you're able to soak up by just listening to them, and how much more well-informed you would be by having conversation with them, right? So what Malidoma is claiming is that will settle the restlessness that's going on in our society now, right? The wisdom of the elder has been forsaken within our society because we don't pay attention to them. We don't give them their proper place. Okay, and I'll end my notes with this. So the very last paragraph on page 13. Alienation is one of the many faces of modernity. Does anybody who has not heard of this term modernity before? Okay, so the way to think about modernity. So if you know, to think about the first week of class, we talked about African people were the first people on the planet. We talked about how the European doesn't come into the scene until 320,000 years, right? Juxtaposed to Africans 8 million years. We talked about the society of Kemet. We talked about the Nubian societies a little bit, right? So at this time, when we were talking about in that past, right? African people were ruling the world, okay? Just to kind of put it plainly. Once that time ended and the Greeks and the Romans were able to successfully make their way into Egypt or to Kemet, right, and take over Kemet and name it Egypt, once that took place and that information was siphoned or stolen from Kemet, brought back to Europe, and they tried to make it their own, that is the start of modernity, right? When the Europeans effectively took over the world is the start of modernity. That's the apex of modernity, okay? So alienation is one of the many faces of European domination, right? What is alienation?
It's when you like take yourself out from society, kind of like you're alienated. How do I
You're
explain?
isolated, right?
Isolated. There you go. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
you can't relate to one another, right? So that's one of the many faces of modernity. The cure is communication and community. Think about Glissant, right? This idea of relations. This is what Malidoma is talking about. A new sense of togetherness, again, relation, right? This is the cure to this process of alienation produced by modernity. By opening up to each other, we diminish the pressure of being alone and exiled. I have told you my story here with the wish that it will be of help to those who pick it up with a sense of hope, searching for answers of their own, right? So this is Malidoma's desire for the book. This is Malidoma's claim that will prevent the alienation that is being produced by modernity, is this notion of relation, right? What we have really been dealing with for the past 3 weeks. The readings of Ma'at were about creating a societal relation that is healthy and wholesome, right? Poetics of relation, he explicitly talks about that in the Poetically Open Boat. And we hear in Malidoma's desire on the last paragraph to combat this alienation is to form relation, new sense of togetherness, right? That gumbo that we talked about last week, when you bring all these different flavors together and it produces a new flavor, this new sense of togetherness. So we'll jump into our fishbowl. Is there anyone who wants to volunteer for the fishbowl?
I do.
Okay, Zahara. All right. Anyone else?
I'll go.
Okay, Trisha. And then Eshaul, you too? Okay.
I'll also go.
And Jack. All right, so that'll be the 4 for today. I'm on mute, so whoever wants to set it off, it's on you.
So what I do basically when I read, I just kind of I take notes on the little notepad, and I basically kind of wrote. I actually didn't know what a talisman was, so I searched it up, and it was actually like a necklace. I don't know if that's the right definition, right? It's like a, it's not like, it's like, it looks like a necklace, something around your neck, or am I wrong?
It's like a I'm trying to think how to frame this to you. It could be a variety of things. It could be a necklace, it could be a pouch, it could be a rock. One of my mentors, his talisman is like a little rope that's in a pouch, right? But what it is it holds spiritual power, essentially what it does, right? It's like an object that has spiritual power within it.
Oh, okay, so you kind of choose kind of like
Yeah,
what.
the elders will assign which your particular talisman will be. So in the book, when he goes through his ritual or his initiation process, he's assigned his particular talisman based on what his job and his role within the community will be.
Okay, I get it.
Yeah.
So basically, what I got from the reading was how we're all born with like a purpose to do different things, like variety things, like you're destined to do certain things, to like make your parents proud, or like do something in the world, like do some type of change. And also what the reading is saying is like how we should have a connection with like the culture, like the past. Like don't forget what happened back then. I feel like we gotta connect to it and see how we can change that. And also in a sense, have a connection with one another so you guys can have like the same reality, like the story, like the reading was saying.
Yeah, going along the lines of it. So Um, I believe what the reading was trying to tell us was, well, personally, like through Maladoma's experience with being like taken from like his home at a very young age, and then trying to like fit back in, but like it took time for him to fit back in. What I what I think that kind of means is that, like, yes, there's well, sometimes there will be change in our lives, sometimes for the better, sometimes it's for the worse, but change will come, it's inevitable. But we shouldn't forget like where we sprouted our roots, or where ancestors sprouted our roots. We should also as much as we rely on this new change that we're experiencing, we could also rely on where we come from.
So what I took from the reading was that even after they were taken over and they were forced to learn the quote unquote, what the author says, the white man's reality, and like everything that they when they kidnapped him, um he never lost his culture. And if he was in that route of forgetting who he was, or um believing everything that the white culture was putting on him, he always had his ancestors to go back to. And they showed him the key to his culture, his lifestyle, and everything like that. Like, he even states toward the end of the passage, in the last pages, he says that he goes back to his home, because he doesn't consider it like a place where he was taken from. He considers it as his home, and he says that he goes back to his ancestors, not to visit or to check upon his family, but he goes back for a cleansing. And in that sense, I feel like he says that it's like the toxins that were released on him while he was in the in the new world, I guess you could say. And he wants to have a sense of root in his culture, where he was born and was kidnapped from, basically.
Yeah. I want to piggyback back on 2 points that were made in the fishbowl. Jack, in a roundabout way, he talks about the alienation that is problematized in the last paragraph by Malidoma, right? He says that, he was stolen from his, and really, Zara talks about it too in a way, but the process of being stolen from his Dagara land, right? Being trained in the missionary schools that were French, right? And then having to come back home and not fitting in home, right? Because he didn't get to go through his rites of passage. He didn't go through the normal processes that a child his age was able to go to, because he had spent his time with the white man, so to speak, right? But that's the alienation that that Malidoma is talking about, that Jack mentions also, right? This not having a sense of home. And I'll explain it in 2 separate ways. For my indigenous students who are from Mexico, from South America, from Guatemala, etc., right? Mexico, to some degree, can be considered your home, right? That's your ancestral home. That may be where your parents or your grandparents are from, right? But if you weren't born there, you don't quite fit in there, right? But then, because of your ties to your ancestors and your roots in Mexico, you don't by and large fit in this society either, right? Dominant society, white culture will try to classify you as a minority, right? So that's a sense of alienation that you can experience from an indigenous paradigm, right? Even for those who were born in Mexico and spent, or wherever you're from, right? If you spent significant time there, then you migrate, right? And you spent some significant time in the States. When you go back, it's not the same, right? So you're still somewhat alienated from that indigenous culture that you came from, even though you were born there, right? That's the sense of alienation. For my Black folks, code switching. What is code switching? Anybody can answer, but I think I'm gonna use this example for Black folks. What is it to code switch?
I don't know like how to define it, but for me, when I code switch, basically I'm basically making other people comfortable by using a certain term. Like, for example, sometimes I'm like, for my friend, I'm like, what's up? But with other people, I'm like, hello, how are you doing? And stuff like that. I kind of make them comfortable because I don't know. I feel like sometimes they're uncomfortable because it sounds ethnic or whatever. It's just not out of their, I mean, it's not in their comfort zone. So I speak in a way that is suitable for them.
Absolutely. What we call our work voice, right? Like you hear me. Well, I don't use the work voice. This is how I talk all the time. I don't do none of that shit. I am anti-code switching, right? Like this is part of my method. But she's absolutely right. The impetus of code switching is to make the other culture, the dominant culture, feel comfortable, right? That is an example of our alienation, right? Because if you get comfortable and you want to be in your blackness, you're considered ghetto, right? You're considered uneducated, right? You're considered invalidated, right? So you have to contort your voice and speak all weird to make yourself feel comfortable and be validated. That's an alienation. That's a displacement. You have no home. You're always trying to configure and contort yourself to make others feel comfortable, right? That's an example how we, as one manifestation of how Black folks experience this alienation. So this is what I kind of got from Jack's comments. Zahara, she brought up this notion of decolonization for me. Does everybody understand what colonization is? Or does anybody need me to explain colonization? Because it's fundamental that you understand.
Could you like explain it a little bit, please?
I'm gonna give you guys an example. And I'm gonna use Nakai because I can see him and he's in his house and he's chilling, right? So Nakai's at home, he's chilling. I pull up to his house, bang on the door, kick the door in, like Nakai, homie, your refrigerator, all that food in there, that's mine, right? Your money that you made in that house, your safe, all that shit is mine. Any jewelry you got in that house, that's mine, right? And what you gonna do, when I'm hungry, homie, you gotta make me a sandwich. This yard, the grass and the weeds is growing, you need to go fix that shit. Trash is pulling up, you need to go take that trash out, right? So it's the process of taking over someone else's space, extracting their resources, and sometimes putting them to work, right? Sometimes taking them and making them work your land somewhere else, right? This is this notion of colonization. Taking, home invasion is one way, another way to look at it, right? But most importantly, it's the extraction of resources, right? Whether they be human resources, like the enslaved Africans that were taken from Africa, or whether it be the material resources, oil, diamonds, gold, ivory, right? Everyone on this phone, on this Zoom has either a computer or a phone or both, right? Coltan is the mineral that makes these devices work. They would not power on without this mineral, right? That comes from the Congo. So by and large, if it was not for the minerals from the Congo, we would not even be able to have cell phones, right? That's a process of colonization. Do you think that the people from the Congo are getting money off of these $1,000 iPhones? Fuck no, right? It's colonization. So what Zahara is talking about is how Malidoma was able to decolonize himself constantly, right? He had to go back and take a bath, get a spiritual bath to wash off all that westernization that he's experienced while being out here, right? He had to reconnect with his elders to make sure he's grounded in his traditions. You guys didn't get to read this, but when he leaves from the seminary schools, and when he's in the seminary schools, excuse me, and he starts to kind of go down that white man's path too far, his grandfather would appear, whether it be in a dream, whether it be in a vision, whether it be in a supernatural deity, right? He would come to bring him back. And when it was time for him to get up out of there, he got in a fight with one of the priests, and it was his grandfather who appeared and guided him back home, right? So the importance of being grounded to your ancestors, the importance of having connected roots to where you came from. the process of decolonizing yourself, right? Not allowing the home intruder to not only take over your home, take over your resources, but take over the way that you think about yourself and you see yourself in the world, right? This is that process of decolonization. So those are a couple of things out of the many things that were said in the fishbowl that stuck out to me just by taking notes. So what we'll do now is we'll open up the conversation to the class, and we could discuss one of two things, right? What is the thread that you guys found between the three readings? Or what I'm more interested in, what is your individual purpose? And if you don't know what your purpose is, we could discuss that too. Preferably from somebody who we have not heard from.
Well, what I shared with my group is that I believe both of those questions are kind of connected in the way that I believe that what the three past readings have had in common is that they all are kind of guiding the society or the community in like the correct way to live their life. And also just wanted to point out that what they have are not necessarily rules like we mentioned in another one of the meetings, but it's more kind of like I said, it's more like guidance. So where maybe they are like rules, but it's up to the community how they live their lives at the end of the day. So I feel like that also has to do with the second question, because I think that, you know, like we all have our own destiny, but we also have like a say over our lives. So I believe that, you know, we also control in a way like how our life turns out, even though we already have a destiny like for ourselves.
Absolutely. So Natalia, one way to think about it, right? You could either, the choice is to fulfill your destiny or your purpose, or to say nah and disavow your destiny or purpose and not fulfill what you're put here to do. But what would you say, if you could articulate, what do you feel is your purpose or your destiny on this earth?
For me, that's actually something that, if I'm being honest with everyone, I've been pondering about that lately, just because like I'm not sure exactly what I want to major in, and I've actually been thinking about it lately, just because it's my first year, but next year I'm already going to be a sophomore and we need to declare a major. So I'm just like trying to, I guess, find what that purpose is. Like for me, something that's really important to me is that I like helping people, and that's something that I really enjoy doing and it's important to me. But I'm not sure exactly, like, I guess what my purpose is, and it's something that I've been trying, like I've just been pondering about it and I've been trying to find.
What are you good at?
Well, I think something that I've been thinking about is possibly becoming a teacher. I have worked with kids before. I worked in an after school program, and like I just noticed that when I help my siblings with like their homework or classwork or whatever, like I'm patient and I enjoy helping them out. Like I like seeing them learn and like, you know, understand all the concepts and everything.
Yeah.
So that's something that I do believe I'm good at.
So I think that's informing your purpose a little bit, right? So another way to talk about what you're good at is a talent, right? Something that you're born with that you could do naturally. You're born with that for a reason, right?
Yeah.
9 times out of 10, that talent has to do with your purpose. So start putting that into your contemplation about your purpose. Who else wants to share a comment?
But like when you're looking for your purpose, like, because I feel like you don't know it right away. But like, wouldn't you find it as you go? Like you're not born knowing like what you're gonna do. I feel like, or even thinking about it, I feel like it just kind of happens. Like you do what you gotta do, like what your actions kind of lead to it. But I feel like it kind of just happens.
You're absolutely right, Trisha. And I think if we are to refer back to the reading, right, that's what he talks about when he says the restlessness with the people in the West, right? If you don't know what you're here for, you become restless, right? Like if you wake up in the morning, you don't have nothing to do, you don't know what to do, you're restless. You're trying to look for something, you're bored, right? You're trying to look for something to occupy yourself, right? That's a restlessness. So what Malidoma is saying, that restlessness is due to not having a connection with your ancestors. And I'm gonna get to addressing your point in a moment, but think about this. So Malidoma, his name detailed his purpose, right? So to Trisha's point, you're not born knowing your purpose. But if Malidoma's name dictates his purpose, who knew his purpose? What'd you say, Zara?
His parents, because they're the ones that gave him the name.
Exactly, right? So that connection that his parents had with their ancestors allowed Malidoma to know his purpose from birth. How it's set up, right? When I find out that I'm about to be a father and my wife is pregnant, right? You go speak to your elders, you go through a ritual and you get deviations and they tell you what your child's purpose is. And at that point, it becomes your task to do all in your power to make sure that your child fulfills their purpose, right? So that's how, to Trisha's point, that's how the African societies counterbalance that, right? The parents got with the grandparents who got with the ancestors who said, this is the child's purpose, to befriend the enemy. So you're gonna name him, we should name him Malidoma because that means to befriend the enemy, right? So that way, every time he hears his name, he knows what his purpose is, right? So that's the institutions that these Africans had in place to counterbalance the problem that we in the West are experiencing that Trisha articulates, right? That restlessness. I didn't know what my purpose was. Shit, I'm 37. So I was 30. That's what I knew what I was put on this place to do, right? When I found out that my daughter was born or was going to be born, ironically enough, my purpose became very clear to me, right? So that's a very good point, Trisha. But at the same time, we have to recognize the brilliance of ancient African traditional culture to kind of make sure that that's not an issue, right? It's that connection and that tie to your ancestors. Who else wants to comment or share?
Going off of what Trisha and Natalia said, I feel like we're all asked that question, like coming out of high school, going straight into high school, like, oh, what's your purpose or what's your goal in life? And through all the pandemic, I don't know if like some of us have seen like our purpose or like have seen what awaits for us in the future. Like, yeah, some of us or some of you guys like start your own little small businesses, and like that could probably be your purpose, but you don't know it. Like if that's something you enjoy, like that is something that could evolve, but we don't see it at that moment, in the moment that's in front of us. And I feel like that's what we struggle with, because like we all live to a tight end schedule where we have to we all try to fulfill that schedule, and we never see like our purpose. And if we see it, it's too late for us to accomplish, or sometimes we just choose not to do it.
Yeah. And you bring up a really good point, right? You're so tied up with your schedule, right? You're so tied up fulfilling other people's purposes that you can't even live and find out what yours is, right? As I mentioned, I worked for Apple before I started lecturing. So at that moment, right, my life was dedicated to fulfilling Steve Jobs' purpose, right? Or not Steve Jobs, what's that fucking, Tim Cook, excuse me, fulfilling Tim Cook's purpose, right? So I didn't have the luxury to think about what my purpose could be because my time was dedicated to my work, right? Also, I want to draw a distinction between your purpose and your job. Not always are they mutually exclusive, right? Think about in the West, when you meet somebody, what's your name? And what's the next question they ask? What you do, right? And you guys may not experience this yet because you're still in school, but once you start meeting people as an adult, right? Well, so what do you do? And the only reason that they ask you that question is to determine how much respect they should give you, because that tells them how much money you make, right? So, oh, you're an engineer. Okay, right?
True.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. I'm going to get a PhD, right? So, and it's funny. I don't know. Y'all might not be familiar with Claremont, but it's a college town, uber white, right? Like super suburban, cut grass, picket fence, all that shit, right? So when I'm going to do my grocery shopping, I'm off in Trader Joe's. It's interesting how I see the conversation shift from just talking to a regular motherfucker, to, oh, you're going to get your PhD. Now you want to talk to me in a different type of tone, right? Now I've gathered a certain type of respect from you. Only because of these last 3 letters that's going to be on the end of my name, right? What is that? So it's not always that your purpose is going to be aligned with your job. But if you're lucky and you step into your purpose early enough, you can kind of make sure that your purpose does lead to your job, right? That to me, that is what success is. Finding a career, an occupation that allows you to fulfill your purpose. In my estimation, that's how I would define success. Let me get one more before we call it a day. Thoughts on the reading, or what do you think your purpose is? I'm more interested in the second question though.
So the reason why I'm in college is to become, well, later become an OBGYN. And for some people who don't know, one of the parts of my job will be delivering children, and I'm also will be helping women with their reproductive systems. So for the past couple of weeks, I was like, dang, I have to spend years in school, and that's a lot of money, but years of dedication to become a doctor. And I won't even become a doctor till I'm like maybe 30 years old, but I still have to put in the work. But for some reason, I keep like the inside of myself says, just become a doula, like a traveling doula or a
You read my
doula.
mind, but go ahead. I'm sorry, go ahead.
And just do holistic things like that instead of like having the Western science and putting poison. Well, not, I'm not even going to get into that conversation, but helping women from low income communities and giving them the help that they need instead of just giving them what I think, oh, just get this, or oh, you're fine. You don't need my help or anything. I'm going to serve them and give them what they need. So that's what my purpose is.
So I'm going to respond with this anecdote. The biggest threat to the Black man is the police. The biggest threat to the Black woman is the doctor. I'm gonna say that one more time just so y'all make sure y'all got what I'm saying. The biggest threat to the Black man is the police. Eric Gardner, Philando Castile, George Floyd, Trayvon Martin. I could go on and on and on and on and on, right? That's the threat that the police pose to the Black man, right? The biggest threat to the Black woman is the doctor. For those who aren't familiar, look at Serena Williams' pregnancy experience. Perfect depiction of that. So the purpose that you're speaking to is so vastly important within the Black community, right? And when I heard you say that, the first thing that popped into my mind was holistic health, right? So if you would like, what's your major, Kaylin?
I'm a biology major.
So the chair of the Pan-African Studies Department, Dr. Dr. Lawson Bush, he is a spiritual priest. He's an African spiritual priest, right? Matter of fact, the reason that I know about this book is from him. He does holistic births. He trains doulas, right? So he has, I think about 3 doulas. Matter of fact, one of them lectures at Cal State LA in the Pan-African Studies Department, right? So if that is something that you do want to get into, that could be a great resource to kind of help you navigate that process. And also, don't be afraid to do both, right? How much powerful would you be to have the science of Western medicine, like malodoma, but then also have the science of indigenous spiritual practices, right? To be able to breathe and speak life into that baby before it even opens its eyes, right? So it doesn't have to be either or, right? That may be your task, that may be your purpose to be able to oscillate between the two. Just throwing that out there. But my homework for you guys for today and through eternity, find your purpose. Search without ceasing for your purpose. Search as if your last breath depended on you finding your purpose. And then once you've located that purpose, fulfill it. And Do not stop until that purpose is fulfilled, right? This is the belief in the core of my soul with every fiber of my DNA, right? I'm not going to leave here, this earthly plane, until my purpose is fulfilled, right? That's how I believe life works, right? Once you've done your task, you get to go on, right? You get the opportunity and the blessing to be able to go on, right? So that's why I say, don't stop until your purpose is fulfilled, because once you find it, once you're doing it, you'll stop, you'll know when it's time to stop, because your heart will stop beating, right? That's the African belief, right? You're here for a reason. They say you chose your parents. You chose your parents, right? In the Western world, that shit don't even make sense. How I'm gonna choose, I wasn't even here, how I'm gonna choose. But you chose your spirit. The energy that was in you that makes up you already knew that I was here for a purpose, right? And I'm gonna attract these two individuals to come together so I can fulfill my purpose, right? So search for that purpose without ceasing. And once you find that purpose, fulfill it as if your life depends on it. Because if your life may not depend on it, but my kid's life might depend on it, your grandchildren's life might depend on it, your nieces and nephews' life might depend on it, right? So that's this notion of relation. We're dependent on one another. And we'll only be successful if we are fulfilling our purpose and living our purpose, right? And then we can relate to one another and help each other find their purpose, right? My job as your professor is to help you find that purpose, to start asking questions to get you closer to unraveling what that purpose is, if I'm doing my job effectively, right? It's not about grades. I personally don't care about that. You will get your grades, but if you come out of my class with being closer to your purpose, then I did my job, right? That's what my goal is. That's what my purpose is, right? That's why I chose to be an educator, to help you all be closer to your purpose, right? May not give you the answer or tell you what that purpose is, but at least nudge you in the right direction, or at least to let you know that your purpose isn't tied up within that 40 hours that you spend at somebody else's job, right? That's the furthest from the purpose. That's antithetical to you living your purpose. That is enslavement, right? That's how enslavement manifests itself in 2021. Working for somebody else and living someone else's dream. That stifles your ability to be great, right? So let me get off my umbrella and my high horse. I'm just gonna show you guys what the next reading is and we'll call it a day, okay? Give me 1 second. All right, share my screen real quick. Sorry for keeping y'all over. I know I'm a little late on time. But to me, this is what's important, right? Like, this is why I do what I do. Okay, so we read, so next week we'll be in Ngugi, Decolonizing the Mind. So it'll be the introduction and then the opening chapter. It's not a lot, but it's a little bit dense. So take some time with it, enjoy it. And again, it kind of picks up where we left off with here from a certain regard, especially in the conversation around decolonizing space and decolonizing your thinking. So just again, it will be in Ngugi, Decolonizing the Mind. All right. Is there any last minute questions, comments, or concerns?